Good morning and welcome to our session today on viability and development appraisals in affordable housing, run by our very own local government capacity centre here at Homes England. So my name's Tom Baker and I'm a senior planning and enabling manager at Homes England, based up in the Newcastle office. And today I have the privilege of supporting our local government capacity centre, who are this summer delivering a series of workshops. You might have attended a few last week, and they also run for this week, which are essentially about delivering on training and CPD on topics that our local government capacity centre colleagues have discussed with local government officers over the past sort of 6 to 12 months. Today's event is about the delivery of affordable housing and the viability challenges of that. And it's going to be delivered for that reason a little bit differently, which I'll get into shortly. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to do now is introduce to you the local government capacity centre. So this year's summer learning programme is brought to you by the capacity centre. This slide shows what they do and what they're all about. Essentially, it was launched in response to some research and consultation that the agency did with our local government partners, and is essentially about ensuring that where possible, the agency can support our partners with learning, CPD, support and guidance in response to topics that you've told us you're interested in and where that support is most needed. Next slide, please. So in terms of today's agenda, shortly I'm going to be passing over to Steve Beard, who's going to be running today's workshop. Steve is a practitioner in the private sector, and he's got over 25 years of experience in both the public and private sector. He's a partner at Beacon Partnership, where he specialises in financial modelling. And Steve later will be joined by our very own Steve Sheen, a senior affordable housing manager at Homes England, who will be assisting us with some Q&A. Next slide, please. So why affordable housing viability? Well, as I've mentioned, this is the third seasonal learning programme that the agency has ran. And at the end of each learning program, we reach out to our local government partners and we ask them what more they want to know, what more they could do with a targeted session being provided. And this topic area is by far the most popular session that we have requested. So we felt obliged to provide it, and we've got some fantastic experts to respond and to help us out today. It's a particularly technical subject matter, and it's quite a practical subject. So as I mentioned earlier, we felt running the session a little bit differently might work. So this is a workshop based session. So we're going to have the first sort of 90 minutes or so, where Steve Sheen's going to be running the session through a sort of spreadsheet-based workshop, building a model in front of your very eyes. And essentially, it's going to go over the fundamentals of affordable housing viability appraisal work, looking at the importance of different assumptions, and also discussing how one might interrogate the model and some of the key outputs. I think importantly, this isn't about being an expert after just one session, but rather it's about showing you the mechanics of how it works, the different inputs that go into it, and the importance of it in a current context. So I'm now going to pass over to Steve, who will share his screen and start running through the workshop. So I'll do that now.
My screen hopefully is come up. So yeah, what I was going to do, got an hour and a half, basically going to build a viability model for rented housing from complete scratch. So hopefully, some of you know Excel. This is just a blank Excel file. and I'll go straight into it. So when people are looking at, can they afford to build a social housing scheme, they have to obviously calculate, does it work? And the first thing I'll start typing is they type in a schedule of units. It's called the schedule of accommodation. Normally, I've got the schedule of homes here, and they'll have a box for a description. So if I put in, say, 5 rows, so they'll build different things. So they might build some 1 beds, some 2 beds, maybe a 3 bed for a house, 4 bed house. I'll call these flats at the top. So 1 bed flat, because there's a difference in terms of viability, which I'll come on to. So we've got a mix of homes there, and they will say how many there are of each. So they'll need to tell the software how many there are. So let's say there's 6 ones, there's 10 2 beds, 3 3 beds, and say 2 4 beds. And what will happen is these will be added up. So if I press this auto sum in Excel, it will add up these numbers. So we've got 21. I'll just make that grey. So yeah, 21 homes, say, in this scheme. And because it's Excel, if you change these, they will change. In any model, you'll need to type how many bedrooms there are, because basically the rent of a unit is determined by the number of bedrooms. And one key thing, which is quite crucial to viability, that people don't always quite appreciate, is the internal area. So how big are the homes inside here? So I'll put some sizes in here. So there are minimum sizes. So there's the nationally described space standards, people call it NDSS for short, and there's minimum sizes. So a 1 bed 2 person flat on a single story needs to be 50 square meters. I'll put in 52, a bit more, because people rarely hit the minimum sizes. So these are slightly above the minimal areas. And this is kind of the inside of the unit. So this is all of the space behind the front door. I'm going to add up at the bottom how big that is. So there's a formula in Excel called sum product, and I can multiply the number of homes here by the sizes here. So there's 1,523 square meters. I'm just going to make that grey there. Just going to get this a bit better as we go. So that's behind the front door. Anyway, this area here, and then you've also got circulation space. So in flats, not in houses, but in flats, you've got circulation space for areas behind the main door to the flats for like bike stores, bin stores, plant rooms, stairwells, lifts, means of escape, which is going up at the moment. And typically this is typed in as a percentage of the internal area. So let's say on these flats, as well as the 52 square meters behind the front door, there's an equivalent of 25% of that. Just get around the building and get to your front door. And this is relevant because you have to build it. So the reason we're entering these areas into a model is because people tend to work out their build cost on a rate per square meter. So this is all area, basically square meters that we need to build. So it has quite a big impact. So we'll have the total area, and the total area would be the 52 times the add on 25% here. So for the 1 bed flat, we've got to build 65 square meters of accommodation. I can copy that formula down. I'm going to just copy across this formula here. So there's 1,781 square meters in our development. There's 2 more things you'll need to say in a model to complete this bit. So this is very relevant, the open market value. So let's move that along. So you'll need to type in what is the unit worth. I'm just going to make this into money here instead of value. So yeah, what is this one bed flat worth? And I've put in a value here. I'm kind of using kind of a like Manchester type value here. These kind of are typical values in Manchester for new build in Manchester itself, I imagine. And then so if we type those in, we can drag this formula along, and we can see at the bottom here that this development's worth 4.8 million. So it's not worth that as social housing because you're not selling the units, but that is if it was private sale, that is what the development is worth. And the last thing you'll type in is formula rent, and I'm using formula rents today. Obviously, some developments might use affordable rent, which is up to 80% of market rent. Formula rent is also called target rent. They're the same thing. That's kind of what people would these days call traditional social housing rents. But then in addition, in London, you've got London affordable rent, you've got London living rent, and there's a whole host of intermediate rents. But formula rent is what people would say was social housing. So I'm going to type in the values here in decimal places. So it's 84.57. I'm just typing these in because I've checked beforehand, but most models will calculate this for you. So if you've got a viability model, there's plenty out there that they calculate this value based on this value over here. They're linked. So that kind of completes a schedule of accommodation. That's what you're building. So it's the first key part of the model. I'm just going to copy this across here, this value. So at the bottom of the formula rent, we've kind of got we've got 3 key bits of information, and I'll color them in pink. So we know how big our development is. We know what it's worth, and we know how much money we're getting for it. So that completes like what we're building, and then the next thing to do is to put in. I'll put it down here. Is the cost. So what does it cost us to build? So typically, costs are broken into 3 main headings. So we'd have acquisition, which is sort of land cost, and then you'd also have. Let me just track that down. You'll have the works cost, which is the actual money you pay your builder, and then you have everything on top of that, which is kind of called on cost. I'm sure the word on cost comes from on top cost. They're on top of your land cost and your works cost. I'm not 100% sure that's where it comes from, but those 3 areas add up to give you your total cost. So I'll make this grey here, and we'll start to type in typically what they will say, what we put in. So the land cost. Obviously the land cost is kind of a residual kind of thing. Typically, you'll put in a rough land cost to start with, and you'll adjust it as you go. But let's say our land cost is 20,000 per unit. I can type it in as an amount, but if I do 20,000 times, I'm multiplying it by this 21 here. It gives us a land cost of 420,000. And the benefit of putting this formula in here, in this acquisition box, if I go and change the 1-bed flats here, I had, let's press the wrong button. I had 6 of them. If I change that 6 to 10, my land cost will go up accordingly. So that's the benefit of it that way. The works cost can be entered loads of ways in a model, but typically it's, on an early day appraisal, it's an amount per square meter. So I'll put in a rate here of 2,000. So that's the cost per square meter. And the total cost of that would be the 2,000 multiplied by this total area here. This is this 1781. So if we're paying 2,000 a square meter, we multiply it by 1781, and that will give us works cost here. And you can see if I therefore increase this circulation area, this works cost goes up. So if I pop 30%, you see my works cost here is 3665. If I put it back to 25%, it's 3562. So it does have an impact, and you don't get any more rent for this circulation space. It's I wouldn't say it's dead space, because obviously you need it, but the smaller it is, normally the more viable your scheme. Now, the on cost in a detailed appraisal will be specified. You'll say what are the surveys. You might specify all of the surveys, your legal fees, planning fees, professional fees, contingencies, sales fees. There's loads of them. So anything that's basically not paying for the land or paying the contractor to build it is in this on cost. Typically, you know, for a rented scheme, something like 15%. It will be 15% of the land and the works cost. In the old days, I've been around a while. The housing corporation, as it was at the time, used to publish kind of standard rates for on cost, and on cost were a bit lower than 15. I think there was 13% in London for rented, but that sort of has gone away now, and I think there would be a lot more these days because it was a lot simpler in the past to get planning consents, and consultation was less, things like that. So if I add them up, this gives us our total scheme cost here, which is 459.74579. So we know what it costs to build now, and if the works cost goes up, so works costs are going up massively at the moment. But if our works cost went up to, you know, 3,000 square meter, you'll see this cost here go up to 5. It's a huge impact. So works cost is by kind of, you know, it's the main thing I think that affects viability in terms of cost. So from there, we can kind of look at our kind of first kind of financial test. So it's called a viability model. So the question is I'll zoom out a little bit to do this bit. Is this viable? I'm going to pop this down here because I need to leave some space for some grant to put the grant in. So I have a little financial viability table, and our first viability test is cost value ratio. So what we would typically have is we would have a hurdle. I'm just going to make this wider. So what the cost of value ratio is, actually I should explain first, is what does it cost compared to what it's worth? And the formula for that is our total cost here is 4,579 divided by what it's worth, which is this up here, this 4,800. So I'm comparing, if I make both the boxes green, I'm comparing these green boxes. So our development's worth 4.8 and it's costing 4.5. So it's at least it's cheaper than buying it. This is a really important test. Actual there. So if the works cost was 3,000 square meter, so I'm changing the works cost now to 3,000. Our costs are now 6.6 million, and our value is 4.8 because obviously the value doesn't go up if you pay your contractor anymore. So the actuals now is 138. So that's not good because it would be cheaper to go and buy these homes. You could buy this development if it was for sale for 4.8 million. So you do that and keep, you know, you would take all the risk and spend 6.6 to get to the same outcome. So what you have with all of the tests is you have a hurdle. So this is what you want to achieve. So say it's 100%, which means you want your cost to be equal or less than the value of the units. You have what your actual is. So I've got that back to 2,000 works cost there. Our actual is 95%. And then you have in most models a pass or a fail. So you would have a formula here that would say if the actual there is lower or equal to the hurdle, so if it's lower or equal, then you'd want Excel to say pass, and if not, say fail. And don't worry about following these formulas. I've got to type them in to make the model work. So yeah, this is pass or fail, and it says pass. And in a lot of models, that will be color coded. So it sort of defaults to red, and you can add in Excel this conditional formatting, which is up here, and you can add a rule that says if the text of the sale specific test, if it says the word pass, then make it go green. So I can go fill it with green and click OK. Click OK. So now I've got a pass fail, and you'll typically have a schedule of these, and we'll build this as we go. So we'll have a completed table. So first, very basic test: does it pass or fail? And the one we've got does pass. Let's say if I put the works cost up, we'll do it again to 3,000 square meter. then we fail, and you've got a bit of a red flag in terms of viability. But that's quite a nice test. It's a very, very simple test. It's got nothing to do with the rents, and in one way, it's got nothing to do with the viability because you're not going to sell these homes. So in one way, some people may say, well, this doesn't matter because you're not selling the homes. But it kind of matters in one way because it's kind of saying, well, you could buy it cheaper, so why would we build it? So I'll just tidy this up a bit because I've got all different colors I want to get rid of. So the next thing you would have is like how are you going to pay for the scheme? So we've got our scheme cost, which I just completed on this side, and you'll have another table which will be scheme financing. So basically you need to show where's the money coming from to pay this. And on a rented scheme, it kind of comes from really two places. You've got Homes England grant, or say GLA if you're in London, and that'll be an amount per unit typically you'd use. So let's say in this example we're using 65,000 per home. So you would type that in, and the total would be 65,000, and you'd multiply it by this cell over here, 21. So that would be our grant. So we've got, and I can make that fit. Let's make it a bit wider. Yeah, so we've got a grant there of 1365. I'm just going to make this into a table. That looks okay. The other kind of place you can get grant is, if you're a local authority anyway, is right to buy one-for-one receipts, and you can't combine this with Homes England grant at the moment. So there's an option to do that, and they just changed the rate, so it's now 40%. So if you had 40% right to buy grant, you would have your total cost, because they're pretty much all eligible for the grant, and you'd multiply it by the 40%. And you can see that this is higher than the Homes England grant in this scenario. So if you had right to buy a grant and it wasn't earmarked for something else, in this scenario now you would take out the Homes England grant, the 65,000, because it's better to have 1.8 million than 1.6 million. But I'll put it back. If you haven't got right to buy receipts, you would take that one out. But say you can't have both on the same scheme. So they're the sources of grant for rented development, and everything else you need to borrow basically, which is you've got to pay for the development, and this is a rented model only we're doing. So I'm assuming no cross subsidy from private sale or anything like that. So our borrowing requirement will be our cost minus any grant we get. So we basically, it's the difference. So I've got the borrowing in there, so that's a long-term loan. And if I add these up, I have our total funding, and if I add that, just add in these three here above in light blue, that gives us our total funding. And what you can see is that the total funding here, if I make it yellow, equals on the left the total cost. I've got 4.579. They must match. Your total cost must match your total funding. This doesn't mean this is viable or unviable. It's just showing where is the money coming from to build this scheme. Yeah, that's our funding. And with the grant, you typically choose the best grant kind of available for the scheme. If the scheme doesn't work, you might try and negotiate for more grant with Homes England, or you might try to lower your cost. But we'll come on to that in a second. So this we haven't really covered yet. Is the scheme viable? We don't know. In terms of our viability test, we've just got this cost to value thing here. So what we kind of need to do is see, can we pay back? So this loan here, this is the key thing. This cell in pink. This loan is 3.2 million. Can we pay it back when I make this cell pink from this rent? And the whole of the viability model then looks at that question. Does this £2,000 a week, which is what we're getting in total for these homes, does this £2,000 a week pay back a loan of 3.2 million? And what you can't do is simply say, well, £2,000 a week times 52, let's do it over here, that's 107 thousand per year. If our interest rate, I'm going to delete this in a minute, is 3%, and you say 3%, that you can't do that and sort of say, well, the interest is 96,000 and we're getting 107 from our rents, so therefore it works. It's too simple. You've got a lot of things you need to do. You need to manage and maintain the homes. That's a cost. You've got different inflations, rates, etc. So what you need to do is to start making financial assumptions and build a cash flow to see if you can afford to do it. So I'll leave these in pink for now, and I'll start a table down here for assumptions. So the kind of first assumptions, I suppose, you might make is, what are the management costs? What is this going to cost us to manage? And when people type in their management costs, they tend to type it in as an amount per unit per year. So let's assume our management costs are £400 per unit per year. That would be 400, and I'd multiply it by this 21, which is the number of homes. So our management costs are 8,400 per year when it's let, and then you would have underneath you would have maintenance costs. And our maintenance cost, I'm just going to move that up here because I need to add that up there. Our maintenance cost is typically a little bit higher than the management cost. So that would be 450 per year, say. Get rid of this formatting as well. And underneath the maintenance cost, you'll have a sinking fund, or it may be called major repairs. So this isn't day-to-day maintenance. This is setting some money aside to replace the roof in the future, to replace the windows. I think it's important to put this in models, because I've seen quite a few short-term providers that they might hold on to a home for 20 years, and they don't allow anything major to go wrong. So when it gets to the end of the thing, that the 20-year period, they haven't replaced any windows or kitchens or bathrooms, and the place is kind of in state of bad repair. So if you're in it for the long term, you need to be setting aside money for major repairs, and as the time goes on. So they're our three main costs, that money we pay. And there's one more thing you need to deduct, which is voids and bad debts. So you're renting the units out to get this money in pink up here, this £2,000 a week, but there's going to be times when tenants move out. There's going to be some tenants that get into financial trouble and can't pay their rent. So you allow an amount for voids and bad debts. And typically, I'll put in 3%. Everyone varies depending on what they're experiencing in their existing stock. So those four items altogether there. This is our operational cost. This is what it costs us to have these homes. I'll start to move on, because what we've got now, we've got enough to build, I suppose, the start of a cash flow. So once this is built, how the question is, how do we what's it called? How do we pay back the loan? So the first thing you need to do is, with a cash flow, is say what year it is. So typically start with year 0, which I'll come on to when I do net present value, because we're going to explain net present value at the end. So if you've got a cash flow, the first thing you normally start with is the money coming in. So you've got your rent, and in year 1, your rent that comes in would be, we've added the rents up here. This is £2,000 per week. It'd be the 2,000 times how many weeks there are in a year. I'm going to say 52.18 weeks per year, which I've typed in. Some people say 52.2, some say 52. but to 2 decimal places is 52.18. So that's the number of weeks per year. So in year 1, we've got this money coming in. I'll colour it green, and then we've got some money going out. So we've got management cost, and our management cost in year 1 will be this £400 a week we typed in. So that's what we're saying is the management cost in year 1, and we'll multiply that by how many homes there are, which is 21. So this is our money going out. And because it's going out, I'll put a minus sign in front. So we've got money going out the door, 8,400. Same for maintenance. So the maintenance will be 450. We typed in 450, and we'll multiply that by the number of homes. There, so I put a minus. So I multiplied the number of homes by my 450 maintenance cost. That's another 9,400 going out the door. And then we've got our sinking fund. I'll tidy these headings up in a while. 550 multiplied again by the number of homes. So that's our sinking fund going out. And our last one going out is voids and bad debts. And that is 3%. And we multiply that by the rent. So we're taking away 3% of our rent. I'll put a minus sign to make sure it's negative. So that's the money coming out. So what we'll have, I'll just colour those red. We'll have this money coming in, and we take off these amounts in red. And what we're left with over here is our net rent, or some people call it net operational income. Don't confuse the term net rent with rent excluding service charge here, but that's a similar use of the term net rent. And if I add up these numbers, I'll get our net rent. So if I colour that yellow, so we get 107, we lose this amount in rent in red or pink, and we're left with 75,000. We're now getting a bit closer to answering the question, can we afford to pay back this loan, because our loan is 3.2. That hasn't changed up here in pink. You see, I'll just move my mouse. We know that the money we've got to pay the rent is 75,000 per year because we've taken away these costs. So I'm just going to tidy these up before I move on. I want the numbers to be red if they're negative. There we go. So let me just move this down. So at the end of the session, I think people want the model. I think they can request it, or we'll send it out. So let's make that great. So that's all the start of the cash flow. That's our year 1 cash flow. I'll just move the headings so we can see the headings in the cash flow. Yeah, so that's where we get to at the end of year 1. And what we need to do is extend this cash flow. So, that's year 1. We want to look at the cash flow for a set period of time. So the next thing you would do is add in the inflation rate. So you'd have a rate for, say, rent inflation, and a rate for cost inflation. And you might have in a more detailed model different inflation rates for different years. Like the rent might go up at a different rate to, like, say, 2025, and then the rent inflation might drop down a bit, and you might have a different inflation rate for management inflation compared to maintenance inflation. But because this is building this model in an hour and a half, I need to keep this quite simple. So we'll put in what's it called, rent inflation of 3%, which is quite common. And we'll use a cost inflation the same amount. People do tend to keep them the same. One thing I'll just say on inflation rates, always kind of make sure there's 2 decimal places. I would be quite nervous if I saw an inflation rate expressed like that with just 3%. Because if I type in 2.75%, which is what I've typed in, which the model would use, you can't see that it's 2.75. And these are quite big impact numbers, so always have 2 decimal places. So I'll change the rent back to 3. So we can now build the rest of the cash flow. So if I put year 2, I can drag this down. So, oops, let me get that in. If I drag this down to 60, so we'll go down to 60 years. So there's 60. So we're going to extend this cash flow to year 60, which won't take that long. So so the rent in year 2 would be the rent in year 1 times by 1 plus the amount of inflation, and the amount of inflation is in the cell. So our rent in year 2 has gone up to 111, and if our rent inflation, if I change rent inflation here to 9%, which is probably going to be CPI, it will go up to 117. I mean, who knows if people are going to put the rents up by 9% in April next year? That's a big question. Anyway, that would be the rent in year 2. It will go up by 3%. And if I drag this down, it will add further years. So the rent in year 4 is the rent in year 3 plus another 3%. That's kind of how the models all work, and you'll get a cash flow like this. I'll do the first 4 years for everything, and then we'll sort of drag it all the way down. So the management cost would be the management cost in year 1, and then you'd be 1 plus this cost inflation rate here. So if I do that formula, we get our management cost in year 2, and I can drag that down the same way. I can drag all of these across as well. So this is our sinking fund going up by cost inflation, our maintenance costs going up. And the voids and bad debts, as we did, it was the rent multiplied by 3%. I can drag that down as well. And you'll see the voids go up. The amount is increasing because the rent is higher. So it's just 3% each year, but it's 3% of a higher amount. And our net rent, what we get at the end of the year, I can drag that down, and we see, and because of the rent inflation, is the same rate as the cost inflation. Overall, it goes up because the rent is higher than interest. So that gives us our cash flow, and I can basically drag this down to year 60. There we go. So in all models, you'll have this. Whether you can see it or not depends what model you're using, but that's what will be driving the kind of the cash flow. So now we've got this 2000. Does this 2000 pay back the 3.2 million? Isn't, we're getting nearer now where we can say, does this cash flow here, in pink, does this pay back the 3.2 million? And that's kind of what we need to do. That's what we need to look at. And we build. This is the cash flow, and we build a loan calculation. So, I don't know if there's any questions from that before I move on. If not, I'll
Hi, Steve.
carry on.
Sorry.
Hi.
Yes, I mean, I think that there's questions coming in thick and fast, and we're responding to them in the chat as we go along. So I think what we'll do is we'll wrap up some of the main ones at the Q&A at the end of the workshop, and then what we'll aim to do is to respond to any particular questions that come in via email after the session as well.
That's fine.
Thanks,
I'll
Steve.
carry on. Cheers. So yeah, we've kind of got everything here. I suppose that is pre-financing. We haven't looked at the ability to pay the loan. We haven't looked at net present value, which I'll do in a second. So this is our money in and out. If we was using our own money, this wouldn't be borrowing. It would just be our own money that we plug the gap with, and we'd have this money coming in. So let's move on to the loan. So again, with the loan, starting year 0. So the year. So with any kind of loan calculation, you kind of have this opening balance thing at the start of the year. So we have an opening balance. We'll say, what is the interest cost? We'll have a closing balance. We'll have our rent. And we'll see if there's an annual surplus deficit. surplus deficit. Fill this in a minute and it'll all make sense. And then you'll have a closing balance. Let me put this down. Okay, so in year one, our loan balance at the start of the year, it's this money we borrowed. You know, it's the 3.2 million. So just to recap, you know, the scheme over here was costing 4.757 million to build. We got 1.365 of grant, so we borrowed 3.2 million. So that's our loan. So at the start of the year, here we've got a loan of 3.2 million. We need to know what our interest costs are on this money, because, and that's kind of the next assumption. Is if I go back to our assumptions table, you'll have an interest rate. I'm going to put discount rate because we'll need that as well. It's bigger in this model. So what's our interest rate to borrow this? And people really do have differences on this. I think local authorities, you know, can be as low as sort of 2%, I suppose, and because they borrow on the Public Works Loan Board or have done. And but some HAs can be a bit higher, you know, say 3, 4, 5%, and then for profit or private sector money will be even higher than that if there's a big construction risk. So in this model, I'm using 3.5%. So that's our interest cost. So our interest cost over here will be the opening loan balance times, and I'll just go across just to show you this interest rate here, 3.5%. Oops, that's the wrong one. That's our interest cost in year 3.5% of 3.2 million, which is 112,000. Our rent in year one that we got to pay this is the 75,000. Yeah, because we've got the 107 over here. We took off all of this management maintenance, set some money aside, and that, so we've got 75,000, and our deficit. So we're short. You know, we're deficit there. Is 37,000. So we can't cover it. And what happens in the loan illustrations and is basically your opening balance. You add to it what you've managed to pay off, but we haven't paid anything off. We're actually worse. So it goes up. You know, the loan at the end of the year is higher than at the start of the year. And then with anyone that works in finance who's on the ball, so well, that can't happen. You know, and you know, you can't go to the bank and ask to borrow money on this basis, you know, because they're not going to give it to you. But the reality of it is, for most social housing providers, is they plug this gap. So there's a gap here of 37. They can afford to plug this £37,000 gap from existing kind of surpluses they make each year. Doesn't mean they plug it for free, but they can afford to cover it. And it's kind of plugging this gap is what limits the size of how many homes people can build. Because if we complete this exercise and show that this scheme is viable, it means it pays for itself over, you know, the 40 or 50 years. But the problem is you've got to be able to plug this gap. And if you're a startup organization or a community land kind of trust who hasn't got any stock, they couldn't afford to do this because they can't go to the bank. I mean, I wouldn't lend someone the money if I said, well, I need 112 back, and then they sent me their figures and says, oh, we'll give you 75. So you say, well, I'm not going to give it to you. So it's kind of how it works in year one typically, and there's normally a deficit and it needs to be plugged. So I'll go back to the hurdles and I'll just put in this other test here. So interest cover, and I'm just going to put it as a percent. And our interest cover is the amount of rent we get divided by the interest we have to pay, and that's a percentage. So we're only covering 67% of our interest, or 66.8. I don't normally see that as a hurdle, as you have to hit a certain amount. Maybe for a new organization, there might be a hurdle of it'd be like something like 110%, because to borrow money from the bank to build a scheme, you need to show that you can cover their interest and have a bit spare. So for a new organization, this would be a hurdle. But for an established council or an RP, typically it's not a hurdle, because they're looking at the longer term plan and they've got some surpluses to cover. The other thing you would have in the hurdles is an interest cover deficit. A very similar thing. So what is the deficit? And that is this 37,000. It goes into this table to save people looking at the cash flow. You know, people will be looking at rows and rows of figures. They want to see in a report this little table like what we're building here. So for this thing, you'll need 37,000 in year one to cover, you know, to allow this, you know, for the scheme to be viable, because you're going to have this much extra debt. So that's that there. So the next thing to do is extend the loan thing. So in year two, not year 22, in year two, the opening balance here is the closing balance of the year before. You know, it makes sense. So that just follows on from that. The interest cost, I can drag that down. It's now 3% of this new opening balance, and the rent I can drag down is the 77. So in year two, the rent's gone up here. I'll put it in green. The 77, which goes into here. You can see what's happening. The rent's going up. I can drag these surplus and deficit things down. So we're short in year two as well, 36,000, but not as short. So let me drag the whole of this loan down to year 60. We can start to see what happens. So this is kind of, when the scheme's done, I looked at the figures before I started, it's going to be, you know, viable in terms. So we'll see why is it viable, because it doesn't cover this here. But what happens is the rent goes up and up. You know, it's going up 3% every year. If you've got a mortgage, you know, it doesn't go up. You know, typically, if you get if you buy your own home, like, and you're in your last year of your mortgage, because of inflation, you probably mortgage payments are quite low, and that's just because your income's gone up. And this is the same thing. And what happens is, you can see this figure goes from red to black. This is the annual surplus deficit column, annual surplus deficit. So in year 19, our rent has increased to such a level that it's now covering the interest cost. And as we go down, the rent gets higher and higher, and the amount we owe starts to come down gradually. If I go down this, if you look at this last column, which is our closing loan balance, let me put, if I just go up and freeze it so we can actually see what we're talking about. I just do view these things. So yeah, if I go down, this closing balance going down in year 50, it's paid it off. You know, our loan has gone. We've got an asset that's bringing in an income, which in year 50 is 320,000 a year. We don't owe anyone any money, and you know, this 320,000 per year we're getting, which remember is after all of your operational costs. So this is new money, spare money. You use it sort of to build the next sort of scheme. You know, so it shows how, you know, the schemes are a bit of pain at the start, but once you get to a certain distance in the future, assuming they last 50 years, I mean, that's the plan, obviously. But if it lasts like 100 years, you've got 50 years of extra income here for like future generations. So, so yeah, that's the loan kind of illustration. And what I want to do is to put in our test. So in our, we unfreeze it now. So one really common test is loan repayment year, and there'll be maybe a hurdle for this. So what year do we want the loan to be repaid? So let's say it's year 50, and then have to put in basically formula here. I'll just put in at the end of the loan calculation. I'll just put in a column called test calculation because I want it to tell me when the loan's repaid. So what I do is say something like if this closing balance is negative, is less than 0. So if that's less than 0, then say it's year 999, and otherwise give me what year it is. Oops, what was that? It's a bit of a silly thing to do. Right, so I've got a test here, and what it's going to do is just tell me it's going to be 999 all the way down. I can drag this down. There's loads of ways to do this. I'm just doing this as a quick way for training. This is quite messy, but it's quick. So once it gets to year 50, it's telling me year 50. So I can now put a formula up here in my results to say equals the minimum number, so the lowest number here. And that will tell me when it repaid. So it repays in year 50. I can copy my test. So that's pass. So, loan repay in year 50. And then we want it to repay in year 50. And it does. It repays in year 50. If I now go up here, so where am I? I hope you can see this. That test I put in right at the bottom of the screen here, loan repayment year 50. If I was now to drop these rents, I'm going to get less money in. So if this 84.57 became £60, it now doesn't repay to year 56 because what's happened is the income, coming in each year has gone down. So that's quite sensitive. Also over here, if my interest rate here, 3.5%, I'll put it in pink there. If our interest rate was 4%, it's then 58, and if it was 6%, it doesn't repay. It's 999. So yeah, there's lots of things that have quite a big impact on the model. One thing that really impacts it is this difference between rent and cost inflation. So at the moment, I mean, ain't gonna stay like it forever, but cost inflation is 9%. But if we then said cost inflation in the long term was say 5% here, and we said rent inflation was going to be cut back, I mean, in theory, if cost inflation goes up, rent inflation goes up because they're both, rent inflation's tied to CPI, and CPI is cost inflation. So, but if they was different and cost inflation was higher than rent inflation, you have a very negative kind of picture, because what happens typically is this rent doesn't go up as much because your costs are going up faster and faster. So anyway, I'll turn those back to 3, wherever he was. So yeah, so at the minute we've got loan repayment year 50, and that's our closing balance. Our closing balance of the loan is positive in year 50, so it works. So move on now to the bit that hopefully is not going to lose everyone. I'm going to do this. I'm a bit ahead of time, which is good, so I can actually try and explain this properly. So net present value is described in loads of different ways. The technical definition of net present value is it is the value of all the money coming in and all the money going out over the whole project, but you express it in today's values, and that's the proper definition of it. But people don't tend to get that. But what the present value is a real simple way to understand it, to me, is this low closing balance we went to in year 50, which is there. I would colour this in pink. This 110,000, because we've, by year 50, we've paid our loan. We've got 110,000 profit. It's that. The net present value is that 110,000, but it's in today's values. This is in year 50. So what you do is you bring this back to today's money. You take off all of the basically the borrowing cost that went in, and you bring it back closer to zero. You discount it back, and that's why they call. That's not why they call it, but when you look at net present value, they say, oh, what's the discount rate? and the discount rate is what amount do you bring this sort of amount back. So it's kind of roughly the same. That only works, that definition, if your interest rate and discount rate are the same, but typically they are. So if you're doing net present value calculation, the first thing you need to do is you have to make one additional assumption, and this is one where everyone's really different. So you've got a cash flow length. So how long is your cash flow? Is it, in the old days I put in 30. So, typically years ago, everyone's cash flow was 30 years. Really, there wasn't many outside of that. Nowadays, I think people are looking a bit longer. Sort of realize that, you're going to get this rent for more than 30 years. So why wouldn't you run your cash flow over a longer period? So what we'll use in our model is 50 years. And we can change this once we get to the end and show the impact. So to do a net present value calculation, the first thing you need to do is decide how many years you're going to run it over. So here we've got 50 years. So go along. So just gonna put this in the box. Very nice. So net present value we'll do over here. Start with year 0, year 1. So when you've got a net present value, the first thing you have is the net rent, and our net rent is figure in pink. Remember, we added up the cash flow. That's our rent. So what we've got is a cash flow. If I can drag this down a bit, years, yeah. So we drag this to year 60. So this is our rent basically coming in for 60 years, and I'll stop this at year 50 because we've typed in year 50 when I do the results. But we run it for a certain amount of time, and I could run this to 100. I'm just doing it to 60. Just say scrolling up and down. Doing the training, it doesn't really matter how long you run it for. It's when you stop it that matters in the assumptions. So this is our net rent, and it's similar to the mortgage. So I'll just put this is our. I shouldn't call it a mortgage because it's not a mortgage, it's a loan. But this is the loan illustration here, and this is MPV. And basically, the money coming in is the same. It's this figure, this column rent and net rent. I'll just call this net rent. So it's the same heading. So yeah, net rent in the loan, net rent in the MPV. They're the same. But in this mortgage calculation, we basically added, this interest here. We added. Let's just go over to the rate here. So was it 3.5%? We added this 3.5%. I'll just make that pink here. We added this 3.5%. To our calculations, we're adding in 3.5% of what we've borrowed, and it's in this column. What happens with net present value is you don't add 3%. You take it off. You take it off the rent, and it gives you the same result. This is so if I was to take off 3% of the 75%, I would have, here, I'd divide 1, because I'm trying to get the rate, I divide by 1 plus the interest rate, discount rate. So if I was to take off, 3%, it comes to 96%. So I'm basically taking off 3% for 3.5% in time. To go forward to the year, I add 3.5% in the loan, but in the MPV, I'm going backwards a year, so I have to take off 3.5%, which is this discount. It's actually called the discount factor. That's the technical name. And they don't put it as a percentage in the model; they put it as a decimal place for some reason, something like that. But it's basically bringing this back to the present value. So this is at the end of year 1 in the model, and then the present value So I'm just going to put in here, put in back for beginning of year one. The present value of that money is the 75 multiplied by the 0.96. So that's our present value of the money. So it's only at the start of the year worth 72. So because we've taken off the 3.5% from our rent, we don't need to deal with interest, because we're dealing with interest by keeping this money in the current kind of value. So if I drag this down, I'm just going to use this formula to put a 1 up here to make it consistent. So if I drag this formula down, then in year 2 I have to take off another 3%, 3.5% should I say. And I can just drag this down, and you see every year you're taking off another 3.5%. So if I drag this down, our rent is worth less and less. So in year 10, we're getting 98,000 rent. So I'll make that in pink, 98,000 in rent. That's the same in our loan calculation here. I'll make it pink over there. So in our loan here, net rent is 98, so they're both 98,000. In this model, we've added in all this interest cost by that point. But in the MPV, we've taken off all these amounts. So we're doing the same thing, but this one we're adjusting to go into the future, and this way we're adjusting the future to keep it back in today. Let me drag this all the way down. So that's our present value. So that's the value of our income. And our net present value basically is the amount we borrow. It starts with that. So the amount we borrow is the 3.2, same as the loan. We start with that. We're borrowing that, but every year we're adding, the rent, because we're getting the rent. We're adding the rent in current values, and I can drag this down. So you see, as every year, the amount we borrow is going down because we've got our rent coming in. So let me drag this all the way down, say from here to year 60. All right, so this, I need to make it, let me make it go red. That's important to see. So what happens as time goes on and we get to, let me freeze the panes again. So as we move down, let's get to year 50. So year 50 is in here. Let me color it, give it a color so we can see it. So let's green. So on the loan calculation, our closing balance, let's make that in pink, is 110,000. And the net present value in year 50, or over 50 years, should I say, is 19,000. And these two amounts of money are the same. That sounds a bit weird, but they're exactly the same amount. But the difference is that this is in year 50, and this is what it's worth now. And if we look at this discount factor here, we've got 1.79. I'll take it into a percent to make it look easier, but it's blue. So in year 50, money is only worth 17.91%, today. So if I multiply, I'll just do it here. I'll put a blue, not yellow cell here. If I kind of multiply our loan, what we're left with at the end of 50 years, and people understand this loan thing typically, they understand that you're borrowing money, you're adding rent, you're adding interest, and you're left with 110,000. If I multiply that to bring it back to today, so multiply that by this 17.9, I get this figure here, and this figure here, 1958, is the same as this figure here. So it's the same. So basically, I find it a really easy way to explain it to people, if there's an easy way, but the net present value is the closing loan balance, really. You might say, if you've got different rates for discount rates, some people might discount this by a different amount what they had interest in, and then that relationship will break. But it is the value of what you're left with over the amount of over that period of time you do the project, but it's expressed in today's values. So yeah, that's net present value. What I'll do is I'll put it into our table because it's kind of the main test. People don't want to use this test over here. They don't want this 110,000 figure because it doesn't mean anything to anyone. It's kind of like talking to your nan about how much you paid for sweets. You're going to have no idea because it's 80 years ago or whatever. So the NPV is in today's money, and it's more useful as a figure to talk about because you can relate it to how much you're spending on the project, etc. You know, and you're not looking forward. It's all in today. So let me add it to our table because we can start to complete our table. Please turn that off. So the net present value, the actual NPV. So I need to put a formula here. So because we're going to allow this model to choose any NPV period. So I've set it to 50 because I typed 50 in the cash flow length. But what I need to do is put a formula. It's called sum if. So if this column here, this is the year. So if this year, go to the bottom, if this year is a cash flow length. So if it's 50, where's my 50? So my 50 is here. Let's see where my mouse is. Cash flow length 50. So if it's 50, I want it to tell me what the NPV is, which is in this column here. So that's how the formula goes. I imagine I've lost half of you, but you know, this is only just to show you we're nearly there now, and it just demystifies how all this stuff works. So our net present value is 19,858, and again there'll be a hurdle. So typically the NPV hurdle is 0. So basically, if it's 0, it means that you've broke even, you know, 0 or higher. So you'd have a formula here saying if that is greater or equal to the hurdle, and say pass, not say fail, and that would have the same formatting as this thing here, the format content. So this sort of works, this scheme. And the next indicator you might have is similar thing, net present value per unit. Let me just make that a bit longer. So what is that per unit? So that would be the 1958 divided by 21. So our net present value per unit is 946,000. And again, you might have a hurdle on at that level as well. So typically, so like to work out how many homes you can build, someone might say, you talk to finance and say, right, we've got say you know, £2 million to invest, and we want to build, you know, so if we have £2 million to invest, say I'll type it in here. So that's 2 million, and we want to build 1,000 homes. We want to have an NPV of 2,000, maybe minus 2,000 because it's a subsidy. So you say we're putting in 2,000. So you can say, right, we're allowed you know, 2,000 per unit on average, and if it's, you know, under 2,000, then we can do it. So that's kind of an NPV per unit, and that's quite a nice hurdle because it links your kind of subsidy or viability to the size of the scheme. You know, because if your NPV was say 10,000 as a hurdle, you know, you give 10,000 for one home, or would you give 10? You know, if you're doing 100 homes, you'd want to give more than that. So that's net present value. So yeah, it's how's the scheme? Basically, it's how does the scheme? How does it work? You know, what are we left with after the end of our period? 50 years. So it sort of follows. If I change this cash flow length to make it longer, this NPV is going to go up, because what happens if I change it to 60? Now this looks like a really good scheme because it's making a surplus here. If I color this NPV in pink, this is making 577,000 at year 60. So that means it's making a surplus. It kind of follows with this loan calculation at year 60. That's going to be even more, because this is what it's worth now. At the end of year 60, in money terms, you're making 4.5 million. because this is what you're left with in the future. The NPV is bringing it back to what it's worth now. So it's a really useful test. But one thing is, there's no agreement. Should this be 60 or 30? So this is, I'm not changing any inputs on this scheme. This scheme at 60 years, it looks, oh, this is great. And someone might say, oh, the scheme's working really well. Let's make the units a bit bigger up here. We can afford it, or that. But then the same scheme being built around the corner might have a cash flow length for 30 years. And then you've got this problem. You say, oh, we're losing £1 million on this scheme. And nothing else has changed. We're still getting this much rent. I said at the beginning, this rent in pink, we're still getting £2,000 a week rent to pay back a loan of 3.2, and we're still borrowing at the same rent, at the same interest rate, and the same cost, same management cost. But for one organisation at 30, it doesn't work, and for one that's at 60, it does work. And doesn't seem to be an agreed position on that. I think most people seem to be about 40 a year on average, 45 maybe, but there's lots of guidance for this stuff in the Green Book, which is that the Treasury produced something called the Green Book, which is kind of the guide to doing appraisals. And it basically will say, this is how you do it. It will say it's like this model, in essence. But what it doesn't tell you is what to fill in these boxes here. And I do quite a lot of work for people on this, on benchmarking against other organizations. Or you look at your own accounts and say, well, how much does it cost us to manage a unit? And if we build another 100 units, will they cost that same amount, or is it going to be a marginal cost type thing? So there's all them discussions. But you can see these assumptions in this table, which I'm set up with my mouse, they really have an impact on how you see your development in terms of viability. There's one thing in the Green Book which isn't in this model, and I don't really see it in any model, is that the Green Book, which is the official guidance, says you should bring in social value and non-monetary factors. So if building this scheme and we house 21 people, and say for example they're street homeless, then maybe you're saving money elsewhere, or you're improving their quality of life, and you need to bring that into your calculation. But I don't normally see that put into calculations. And even when you're asking for grant, you kind of don't see it not in the calculations you do in your own model anyway, because you can't use that money to pay the bank back ultimately. Especially for RPs, they're borrowing money. The bank's not going to be interested, I imagine, if they're helping someone's quality of life as much. So, well, can you pay me my money back? It's kind of the main sort of question, and that's what these models are typically for. So let me do one last thing, and I'll play about with the model a bit. IRR, which let me type it properly. Actually, internal rate of return. So the internal rate of return is used alongside NPV, and it basically tells you what. There's loads of ways to describe it, but kind of an easy way to describe it is it tells you what money you make as a percentage each year for doing the scheme. And you need to make enough money to pay the interest because it's before your interest costs. So basically, if the rate of return is above your interest cost, then it works, and if it's below, it doesn't work. But I'll add this to the model. It's really easy in Excel to do. So we've got our net present value calculation over here. So IRR. So basically, you just have a column of numbers. I won't bother putting the year. So I'll just call it cash flows. And you basically have your borrowing at the top, and you have your net rent. This figure, this is our net rent here. That was our rent after management and maintenance cost. But I need to stop it at the year the cash flow stops. So I need to say if the year is less or equal to the cash flow loan, which is over there, or then put the rent in, and if not, put 0 in. So if I drag this down, it will go all the way to year 60. Oh no, it stops at year 50 because our cash flow then I'll put back to 50 years. So at 50 it stops. So we want to work out what the IRR does is it basically works out what rate of interest makes this everything come to zero. Like basically that's why the scheme breaks even. So all I need to do is IRR. You type IRR, highlight this column of numbers. That's all you do. It's very straightforward. You give me a percentage. Something wrong. Yes, didn't have to guess. I've got something wrong. Let's see. Sometimes you're looking. That should type it again. I don't know. That's not. One of these mustn't be formatted as a number or something for it not to work. Or it hasn't got an IRR. I've got no. So if that's not working, I'll have to do that in this currency. I'm not sure why that's not working. No, that's the IRR formula, and it I have to leave that bit, which is embarrassing. Put it in. You put in it. You basically highlight the numbers and point to the discount rate normally to guess it. It gives you a percentage. I is there. It's just really low. So yeah, that's our IRR there. Is that? Yeah. So the IRR tells us what does the what's the interest rate at which it kind of breaks even. So we would have IRR for that figure to be done right. That should be 3%. Yeah. So I mean, the rule on the IRR typically is it above your interest rate? Because if the IRR is above the interest rate, then you can afford to borrow the money. And it's used by the private sector more because the IRR is a return on your income. So what percentage are you making each year? And for the private sector, they don't like net present value mainly because the net present value doesn't tell us how much we're making each year. It just tells us how much we're making over sort of, in this case, 50 years. So the what's it called? The IRR tells us how much we make every year as a percentage. And if you're dealing in private sector returns, then that's what you're interested in, is how much are you making each year. So people tend to use an IRR mechanism for that. So that's kind of it in terms of the model as such. I can just do a quick sort of 10 minutes just to show the big impact things. I don't know if anyone noticed, but anything I colored in orange is the cell that you change. So if you change any of these orange cells, the model will update itself. And if the white ones, in a typical model, all the white cells and grey cells would be locked. You wouldn't be able to change them because you break it. So I think in terms of like limitations of this model, this will actually work. I'm going to take the IRR out because I'm not sure what's happened there. But this will work for net present value, and that this is an actual model that actually does work. What the limitations of this model is, it doesn't calculate this rent for you. And I think especially now with some people moving back to formula rents or target rents from from affordable rent, which was just a percentage of market rent, there's quite a detailed calculation to get these rents, and it's based on this value, taking it back to the year 1999 and then inflating it back to today. So there's quite a complex calculation for this. There's a free one on our website that does it. But if you're doing social rents, as in formula rents, this model doesn't calculate that. So that's a limitation. the other limitation of this, what we've just done, is it only does rented housing. So obviously in real life, you've got shared ownership, you've got first homes, private sale, and neighbouring in cross subsidy in theory to build these homes. So yeah, this is quite a simple model looking at one tenure, but it does actually do it. The other thing it doesn't do, but then again, no models do this, is our cash flow here assumes it goes on for our whole 50 years. There's no right to buy in here. So obviously tenants have, if you're a local authority anyway, some of these tenants have the right to buy, and the chances are that some of them will buy them before the 50 years is up. So it doesn't take that into account. But I haven't seen that taken into account in models, and the main reason being is that if it does happen, it tends to be a benefit, and you can't rely on it, so you don't put it in. But if it does happen, it won't be any worse, because the sales receipt in most cases is enough to compensate. So you don't see that. I think for local authorities, I know there's a lot of local authorities on this call. What's really this works, this scheme, but that, a lot of them don't. And if our works cost, if I change it up here to 2,500, we end up with this situation, and we've got a load of fouls. And the biggest sort of issue I've seen, and I've seen local authorities really struggle with, is they'll set some hurdles. So they'll put in hurdles like this, like what's here. They'll say, oh, it has to be 100% cost of value. The NPV has to be positive. And then the projects will foul those hurdles. And then they'll say, well, if it fails, we can make a case to do it because of, social benefit. It'll be good. It's a good thing to do. There might be typically councillors that say, we really want to do this scheme. You might have had a ballot with tenants and you can't turn back. So that you can always make a case, like with wording, to say, well, we should do the scheme anyway. But the real problem I've found with local authorities is at what point do you say no? Because there must be a point when this is so bad that you just don't want to do it. You shouldn't do it, And I suppose in the real extreme example, say you was just building one flat. I'll take these units out. So I've now only got one flat being built. So I've got £85 a week rent. And let's just say we was buying the flat. So let's say we was buying one flat for £1 million, and some costs there. This really doesn't work. So it might seem obvious, oh, you wouldn't do that. This is losing 960,000. But at what point do you say no? And I think that's a real issue. I think, like at the moment, I'm just going to put it back where it was. How bad does it need to be before we say, look, we can't do this scheme? And I think ultimately, from the people I've worked with, if we make this into a program, so let's say we had a 1,000-unit program, so we can change the numbers to sort of 400, 300, 400. We haven't got many family homes, they tend not to work. I'll just put those in, 300, 4 beds. So in this example now, I've just increased the homes to 1,000. So this would be like a program, this isn't one scheme, but you could use a model like this to look at this. So we've got the same thing. We've got an average works cost, say, let's leave it at, say, the 2,500, and then average acquisition cost now, but still 20,000 per home, what we typed in at the beginning. What would be the, when do you say no, is that to do this, first of all, you need, if I will across here at our loan calculation, I need to make everything a bit bigger now. You're limited here. So this figure in pink is a really good one. So what is our, how much can we afford to plug this gap between all this money we're spending? So we're spending 205 million. We've borrowed 7, assuming you had to borrow it, and our rent is 3.7. Have we got 3.4 million to do these schemes? And if we haven't, you start to limit that. And the other limit is up here. If you want to look at it a different way, this in net present value terms, to build these homes, 1,000 homes, we need 45,000 of subsidy. So have we got 45 million? Have we got 45 million pounds of subsidy or not? So that's another sort of way to look at it. And you would look at an ambition and the average here. So say this worked and this is what you could afford to do. The net present value per unit is 45,000. So on average you need to be within 45,000 in the red per unit. So if you've got a 10-unit scheme and it's sort of 60,000 in the red, you can say, well, look, this is we should be saying no now, because this means we can't do other schemes unless you've got another scheme that can maybe offset it, and maybe then you can look at saying, well, we've got a good scheme here and a bad scheme there, so we can still do our 1,000 homes because they kind of offset each other. Yeah, I've kind of got pretty much to the end. I'm 10 minutes ahead actually. So I say in terms of real big, is someone on mute?
That was me, Steve. I was just jumping in to say there are quite a few questions to get through. So if you feel you've completed the main bulk of the workshop, we're happy to move on to getting through the questions.
Yeah, we can do. Yeah, I mean, I just one last thing I say, like the big numbers, and I've just colour them in pink before we start. Is that affected? Is works cost is a very big one. Inflation here, rent and cost inflation is another one. Interest rate and cash flow is another one, and then these numbers in pink. These circulation area, they're kind of the things. If you had to concentrate on something, I would look at those and say, well, are they reasonable? Especially this, if sometimes you've got urban designers leading program and planners, and they're looking at quality, and you end up with one bed flats that are 10 square meters bigger than they need to be, and 10 square meters bigger at 2,500 a square meter is 25,000, isn't it? So it's extra cost. Yeah, I'm done in terms of that formal part. So yeah, if we want to move to questions, that would be great.
Brilliant. Well, I think for the moment I would just keep sharing your screen, perhaps.
Yeah.
Because there might be a few questions where it might be helpful to refer back to the model.
Yeah.
So yes, I'll just introduce the second of today's Steves. This is Steve Sheen from our affordable housing team. He's one of our senior managers. And Steve has a lot of experience of working in the affordable housing program in the north of England, and will hopefully be able to answer a few questions that we've had about that sort of wider agenda. So I'll just get my list of questions up that we've been pulling together. So I think the first one, this might be for you, Mr. Sheen. Would utilising local LHA rent levels in place of formula rent ever be appropriate for the purposes of social housing viability calculations?
Yeah, afternoon everyone. I think Steve picked on it before around the changes of the sort of rent levels. If we're looking at going up to local housing allowance levels, you're then looking at a different type of product that we'd assess the schemes against that are coming in for grant funding. So that'd typically be for affordable rent because it's going above the target and formula rent. We are seeing that more and more now, just in terms of viability. So where organisations are appraising schemes and coming up with an unviable scheme, even though they've got an ambition to do social rent, they have got to increase the sort of rent levels. So this is what Steve was picking up before on changes to assumptions within the financial model. So unfortunately, we do get that quite a lot, where I said the rents are increasing to up to 80% of market rent as an affordable rent, just to make things stack up. But again, one of the things that we've done with partners recently is where they're looking to increase the grant rate. So potentially looking at, if they still want to do social rent, come and have a discussion with us directly. Don't be just put off by thinking that the grant rate's unachievable, because we know that things are increasing. So if we do need to increase the grant rates and they're still within our financial parameters, it is something that we'd look at. Brilliant.
Thanks for that, Steve. One for perhaps Steve Beard here. So who sets the amount of rent? Obviously, we've made assumptions about rent in the model. Who sets the amount? Is it each RP or a set amount per local authority?
Okay, so I use the formula rents, which sometimes referred to as target rents. There's a formula that is published by Homes England, or a regulator now, and it is based on the number of bedrooms, the location, like where it is in the country. So each local authority's got a different sort of setting, and the value. And so that's for formula rents. I mean, I know some local authorities might have their own rents that they like to see in 106s, but proper social rents are, they're based on just those three things: number of bedrooms, the location, and the value. And it's based the value in 1999. So there are different ways you can index back to 1999. So you have to take the value now and then go back to 1999 and then reinflate. And you reinflate it at a set rate. That's all fixed. But how you get back to 99 can be, use the nationwide index or the land registry index, or your valuer might tell you, for example, might have the valuation and say, what was it worth in 1999? There's a bit of flexibility maybe there. But yeah, they're fixed. You are allowed to go up 5% for general needs housing on these numbers. So to get these rents, what I did was I used our target rent calculator, and that's kind of, anyone can get that on our website, but you type in the current value and it will take it back to 1999 and reinflate by the correct numbers and give you these. And that's what I did to get those rents.
And how does this differ to affordable rent? Because you've obviously been discussing social rent.
Yeah,
how does that differ?
So affordable rent is 80% of market rent, up to 80%. It says up to. Yes, I can't go higher. So it doesn't have to be 80%. It could be these rents. Really, these will probably be okay. But it's typically it would be 80% of market rent. It would be capped at LHA. I think people assume, and sometimes I won't say wrong. I've seen it get very close. People assume that these rents here are below LHA, but they're not necessarily. But they should be, because these are social rents. But for affordable rent, it's capped at LHA, which, in English is housing benefit. So it's capped at housing benefit. And the big difference is service charges. So in affordable rent, your service charge. So what's missing here is the model still on the screen, isn't it? So there's a weekly service charge. I'll just call it service. I've used the word charge. But say that's £20. So your gross rent would be this plus this, so 104. And for formula rents, you're allowed to add on any service charge, and because of that, a lot of development staff, remember, people fill these models in, they never cared what the service charge is really, because you just added it on and it didn't make any difference. But for affordable rent, the service charge is included in the 80%. You don't add it on. So effectively, you take off the service charge, like the cost of providing service charge. And this service charge is different to this management maintenance cost down here. This is housing managers, etc. Service charges, cleaning lifts, cutting grass, that kind of stuff. So that's a big difference. And what I've found in big 106 blocks where you've got, maybe tall buildings, lifts, I've seen stuff with concierge. I've seen the service charge be higher than the rent because it's in a block and it's calculated. There's rules how you calculate it. You can't just cap it, So yeah, so that's sort of the main differences. But this is the low rent in real plain English. This is the lowest rent, the social rent. Affordable rent is higher typically, and maybe sometimes not that much higher, but it is higher.
Brilliant. No, I think that's a really useful sort of definition there. So we've got another question. So if local authorities stipulate the housing need, so 1 and 2 bed houses rather than a 1-bed flat or even 4-bed houses, how does this affect the land value and therefore viability? So this one for Steve Sheen.
Thanks, Tom. I think, again, from a partner's perspective or from a Homes England perspective, we'd expect each of the organisations to be working with the local authority to meet their strategic priorities and need. So that would naturally translate into the way that the scheme's appraised. Some of the things are going to probably be taken out of the organisation's hand, like by sort of stating the sort of type of properties that they'd need to see to meet their housing demand. Again, that would have to be part of the discussion. But I think what Steve picked up on before was the way that you appraise schemes, and that can be a really useful tool for having that negotiation with local authorities, because they may have higher ambitions or aspirations to deliver a certain type of property, but But using the calculations and the model to sort of use that in the discussions is really, really powerful. So you might end up having that as a negotiated point, just to say, we can't achieve everything that you're expecting. Like saying before, that might be a local member perspective, or it just might be local authorities. But then you can come to a compromise where you've got a scheme that you can deliver, and you can deliver it at the grant rate that you've got, and within the financial parameters of the organisation. So again, it's not just a financial tool, it's a good tool to negotiate with local authorities and local members and residents.
Brilliant. So it's as much about showing the process through which you've come to those positions through the model, and for changing assumptions and building that up.
Yeah, you've got an evidence base and a bit of an audit trail. So
yeah,
you're not just making glib comments to say, we can't afford that. We're saying that we can't afford that because of X, Y, and Z. And then you can sort of work through and say, these are the points that we can negotiate and compromise on, and just to get to that point where we've got an acceptable scheme for all parties.
Great.
Tom, if there's time, I could very quickly just show in this model in 2 or 3 minutes the impact of family units and one beds and the difference, because there is quite a, this will show it if I just quickly do it.
So we've got a couple of minutes, yeah, by all means.
Okay, if I'm still sharing. So I'm just going to change this 4-bed house to a 4-bed flat, because flats tend to work worse than houses if there's no land cost, because there's lots of circulation space to build. But if I just build a 1-bed flat, I'll take out the land cost, because let's just assume you're building on your own land, and a lot of local authorities are. That should be 25%, not 25. So you can see this is one unit, one bed flat. This formula rent is here. It's coming out with a positive MPV at 2,000 a square metre, 39,000. So it works. So if I put my works cost up to say, so it's closer to 0, or maybe 2.5. Let's put it up to about that. So that is working in net present value terms of 2,000. If I switch it to the 4-bed flat, I'd expect it to be much worse. And you see the 4-bed flat is making a 93,000 loss. Nothing else has changed. The reason the family homes, in my experience, don't work is the size has doubled. The 65 to 132. So the cost has doubled. I mean, I know big houses probably cost less per square meter to build than small flats, but it's I don't think it's massively different. But the cost goes up with every square meter you build. That's what I wanted to get across. This internal area is important to look at. I think you can't let people, but architects you're paying go ahead and design what they think is good quality, because there is a cost to it. And what happens is this might double, but the rent doesn't double.
Yeah.
And I think that is the thing. So your cost, but the cost here is double because the size is double, but the rent hasn't doubled. So therefore it performs worse. And with London affordable rent, I don't know if there's anyone from London doing this, the rents there are really flat. Like the rent difference between a 1-bed and a 4-bed is something like £30. It's hardly any difference. So yeah, it is what a 1-bed flat, in my experience, tends to work. And with flat grant rates, a viable scheme is going to be the one with the most 1-beds in theory, and the lowest family units. Because in the past, grant was a percentage of cost, and that then allowed that adjusted.
Brilliant. I think that was a useful way of illuminating it, and I think it sort of going back to Steve Sheen's point. I think that's why it's important to really understand all the different factors and how you come up with the most advantageous scheme from a viability point of view, but also in terms of meeting the strategic needs of the local authority. And this exercise can help you balance all that out. One question I've had come in on the model is about, does the on-cost cell include profit and margin?
Oh, that's a tricky one. So in theory, it should not making any profit, because I mean, in a lot of these models are done for RPs and local authorities, and they're looking to build homes, and there's not a profit in there. There'll be a contingency in the on cost. As far as I know, if you're showing profit, then you have to reduce the grant. The grant is not being paid for you to make a profit. Maybe there's a thing about normal profit. I don't know how it works with the for-profits at the moment, but the profit would be, though, I mean, it's not really a cost. The profit in this model is here. This MPV is your profit. there. That 19,000 is what you're making. You know, that is your profit there. So I would say no, I wouldn't see profit in there. What you will have in the on cost is the interest cost you incur during the build period. So I didn't really cover this because I kept it short, but this interest cost here assumes you've already built it, you know, and you're incurring an interest cost as you build it, and that's all within this on cost. And the proper model would have another cash flow with a monthly cash flow that will show, you know, calculate that interest over the build period. Because you don't need to borrow 3.2. That's what you're left with after your grant. But if you get your grant at the end, you actually need to borrow 4.5 until you've got your grant in the bank. Yeah. So, yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. So yeah, we've got another one on the model. So is there a way of carrying over savings on maintenance in early years to later years? I suppose that might be an assumption that during those early years, the maintenance burden will be lower because the property is newer, but I suppose there's snagging and things as well as that. But I don't know what your reflections on that is, Steve.
Yeah, I mean, I think for some very minor tweaks, I've seen maintenance cost in year one be excluded because there's a defects liability period for a year. But I mean, in my experience, maybe it's because I wasn't the best project manager because I worked in development, not finance. But you know, the maintenance cost was the worst in the first year. But the idea is you've got a defects liability period, and you shouldn't be incurring any maintenance. But that's not going to cover, you know, tenant damage, anything like that. You know, so I wouldn't increase these ones slowly for the early years, but people do with the sinking funds. So there are some standard sinking fund patterns that start slowly and ramp up. There was a National Housing Federation one, which was kind of based on, it was 0.8% of the cost effectively over the period, but they made it average over 0.8% over 30 years. So I started at like 0% for 5 years, then 0.3, the next 5, 0.6, etc. So yeah, there are patterns that have a slow start on the sinking fund, or they don't put any money away till year 10. You know, they might do that. I mean, this is all theoretical. It doesn't actually happen like this. You know, I mean, people don't take this sinking fund and stick it in the bank, but it's just to show in viability terms that they're, you know, over the life of the project, they've set money aside to maintain the building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I suppose because this is a sort of forward-looking appraisal, this is just about making prudent assumptions, and obviously, you know, across a 50-year period such as this, things are going to fluctuate massively, aren't they? But this is just about saying, on average, our best assumption that we can make at this particular point in time is that it's going to be around this per year, and as long as that's backed up with evidence and comparables from recent experience, that's good enough for this purpose.
Yeah, I mean, when you really think about the reality of it is really for people with small programs, at least, is one, they don't borrow the money to build this; they've already got it, so they don't need to really prove they can pay it back. It's a paper exercise, I suppose. So is this a viable? Is this a good financial decision to make? You know, if you've got £1 million sitting there doing nothing that you can afford to use, then you're not leaving it borrowing money, then you don't really need this. It does help you stop paying up here. This acquisition thing we didn't touch on. It stops you paying too much here, because otherwise, where do you? I know you get a valuation, but you know, you've got to ensure value for money in that. And where do you stop this acquisition price from going up? At what point do you say, I can't pay more than that? And it's to help that as well.
Just in terms of the cash flow, we've got a question that says it looks like the model assumes the full rent coming in as the same year the loan is taken out, but there will be a build period and you'll be incurring interest costs earlier and throughout the build before getting the rent. And that's a sort of question, I suppose, about how the model works and takes into account the build period.
No, that's right, and I think so that's a really good point. So this doesn't take into account the build period, this model. So what's missing in this model starts from practical completion effectively. So what it does is, in this on cost figure, you're rounding up an allowance for kind of the interest cost you would incur, and that's how a lot of these models work. they divide time into the period before you've rented it out and the period after, and this shows the period after. Any decent model will have the period before, which would just be a monthly cash flow, which will list all of the acquisition works and on cost. You'll say which month you spend each of it. So this 420 would come out on a certain date for acquisition. The works cost will be spread on a S-curve, this kind of pattern over, say, 12 months or something. And then, it will add interest on each month as you're spending the money. And that interest will just be one small line in this on-cost total. So, yeah, this is missing a development cash flow. A 3-hour session or 2.5 hours, we could have done.
I think we've got through quite a lot today, so I think that's perhaps one for another session. And I think what we'd welcome, and we'll wrap this up at the end, is any feedback in terms of any deeper dives or or looking at a particular sort of topic. Then please let us know through our response form for this session. A question for you, Steve Sheen. So, does Homes England take into account biodiversity net gain and other potential planning obligations and conditions in the amount of grant awarded?
Yeah, I think from a Homes England perspective, again, the grant rate or the grant funded units have got to be over and above anything that's within the planning process. So if there's affordable housing that's captured within the planning process, they won't be able to be grant funded.
Yep.
If it's not relating to affordable housing, we do take into consideration sort of offsite contributions and various things. There's a number of things that we consider within the sort of financial assessment. And again, we look at each of these on a case-by-case basis. So if there's anything that's contentious that an organisation's worried about or concerned about in terms of the way that they're going to submit the bids, it's always worth coming around a quick conversation with us first, and we can iron out any of the sort of issues that are coming up. So by the time we press the button to go for the grant funding application or the submission through IMS, we've had those discussions. So by the time we look at the assessment, we know exactly what's coming in. But yeah, overall, we do take a range of assumptions in, especially in things like contributing grant funding. So
Yep.
Brownfield Land Fund, again, that's complementary funding that can be used. We do undertake that, and we have that element of it included in the financial assessment, but the overall value for money perspective that comes through. So yeah, there's a number of things that we consider.
Brilliant. And I suppose it's all about having those conversations with yourself and your team in terms of, working these through.
Yeah, we always say to partners, just come and have a conversation with us as early as possible. One of the things that we're looking at the moment is looking that far, that look ahead through getting the pipeline information from partners. That's really, really useful and helpful. So when we do the look ahead, it's a bit like a car production line. So as the schemes are coming through, we're having these discussions early on. So by the time it comes to needing a decision to be made around the grant application, we can be as efficient as possible and get that decision back to the organisation so they're not caught up in cost increases from contractors and various things like that.
Great. Probably just one question left in terms of timing. So we've got one on the model, Steve. So the financial assumptions made are key for a viability assessment. Where would one go to get realistic market costs and perhaps sort of realistic other assumptions? Are these freely available, or do you need specialist advice?
Yeah, I mean, there's different places, I suppose. I mean, in terms of free, so I did quite a big piece of work for the GLA quite a while ago now, about 3-4 years ago, and part of that involved getting the assumptions, like these assumptions in this financial table, from all of the big London, well, not all of them, but a big selection of the big providers in London, and they published that. I was quite surprised, actually, because people are guarded about this stuff. Remember, people are bidding against each other for land. People don't want to say, there's different local authorities because they're in that zone and they're not competing with each other. But RPs, they don't like this. They wouldn't want to show what they pocket. But anyway, in that GLA report, I can find it, but it's public, and it had a list of all of these things, and it had works cost in it, on cost, land cost, all of these. So yeah, that's free. So it's a bit out of date, but not massively. I wouldn't use the works cost from it. But then we do benchmarking of different costs against other people, works cost especially. but for assumptions, we can benchmark other people's assumptions when we do a report. But it's all
Brilliant.
confidential. Thingy do it as well. M3 Housing do it.
And I think we did have in the chat a couple of local authority partners were also suggesting, getting together to discuss those potentially by region to make sure they're comparable. So yeah, that's really useful, Steve. Right, we're just going to move on to the sort of wrap up. So if we could,
Sure.
Steve, you could stop sharing your screen and we'll share the remaining slides. So these were a selection that, that Steve came up with. So I think the first top tip, Steve, was the size matters in terms of the appraisal. So homes that are larger than they need to be are typically less viable as a result. And I think Steve made the point there also about larger family homes. The costs often double, but the rents very rarely do, and that obviously has an impact on the appraisal. So it's really worth understanding what that housing need is, what is affordable. I think the next top tip is clarity is key. So really, you should be looking to agree a set of financial hurdles, both in terms of the affordability of those hurdles as an organisation, but also the viability of those when you're discussing that with the agency and with and with sort of partners. Viability does not equate to affordability. So I think I put something in the chat about this. So viability is a theoretical exercise that you go through and to establish whether the scheme meets key hurdles. Affordability is often a practical consideration for your particular organisation, and you might have particular strategic objectives set by your members that might mean that you're willing to do something even if it doesn't meet some of those hurdles and benchmarks. So it's worthwhile understanding what your key objectives are and how that might make decisions about whether you proceed or not. And then the final one is get agreement. So really, it's important to have those sort of assumptions agreed. And as Steve Sheen said, the agency is more than happy to have those initial discussions with yourselves just to understand, what assumptions you can make, what assumptions you perhaps shouldn't be making, and to get that agreement and that dialogue up front. As well, we've got a range of different learning resources which are on the slide, which will circulate. There's some links in there as well, containing guidance in terms of the Treasury Green Book. There's some guidance around our capital funding programme and some resources from Beacon Partnerships website as well. I think we've covered this, but we will be sending around a copy of the spreadsheet. Just as a little bit of a disclaimer, it is a learning tool only. So, of course, we would recommend getting professional advice where you're taking this forward as part of a scheme. But notwithstanding, I think when you've got the recording and the spreadsheet and the slides, that should really make a useful learning tool for you to take this forward in terms of your own work. I think finally, just a big thanks to our speakers, Steve Beard on his workshop. Thank you, Steve, and Steve Sheen in terms of the Q&A. And that's all from us, folks. So, yeah, thank you very much. A few rounds of applause. They all go to Steve. He did the most amount of speaking. Yeah, have a great day. Thank you very much.